thanks, Susan, for the invitation to participate in this symposium, and also thanks for actually leading us explicitly away from Auschwitz and torture, so we can discover another world of Améry and actually put his other essays in a far broader context in the way you did it. And you have covered a lot of the subjects I want to address, which actually helps me. No, not at all. Actually, I thank you because you have done much better work than I would have done anyhow. So, really, it's and what I would like to do, therefore, I would want to focus on one aspect of the Enlightenment as Améry understood it, and then highlight what I believe is another inner tension discovered in his work. So we have the theme of reason, and we have the theme of progress, and then there's the whole issue of, as you explicitly said, I think very powerfully and beautifully, the tension of those themes with his essays in On the Mind's Limit. I mean, reason and progress, and I want to focus on a third dimension of the Enlightenment, and then follow it with another internal tension, and that's what I would like to do. And you have mentioned it, but didn't focus on it, and my focus will be on the concept of the human. I think part of the achievements of the Enlightenment, which Améry also thought maybe the most precious of them, is the idea of the human. And by the idea of the human, I mean the following, philosophically speaking. I mean that our moral vocabulary shouldn't be reduced to associational language, shouldn't be owned and controlled and exhausted by associational categories, be it the tribe, the nation, the race, the religious groups, etc. But humans as such, with no other attribute, are subjects of robust moral concern. So for example, just to give an example of what I mean by associational. So you take a right like the right to vote, right? The right to vote is not a human right. It's not given to a person due to his or her humanity, but it has to do with another feature or another attribute of that person, which is citizen. Humans, you don't have a human right to vote, it's a civic right to vote. You want every human to be a citizen, that's true. But it's not a human right per se. So we live in a world of where commitments are drawn, are derived associationally speaking, and a deep thrust of the Enlightenment is to do away with the control of associational categories on our moral and political world. So humans, qua humans, have to be granted moral concern, have to be subjects of moral concern. Now, I want to add to this two things that are very important in this issue. One, they ought to be robust. I mean, it's not a thin commitment. You might say, well, every culture might, not every culture, but many cultures say, we don't cannibalize people, humans, right? Well, that's not robust enough, right? You mean a whole full scale of robust moral commitment to human, and also very important for that world, very important, is the idea that it sets strong limits on associational claims and loyalties. I mean, this realm of the human and the commitment to a human qua human sets serious limitations on different associational interests and quests and loyalties. Now, I mean, we can do a history of philosophy here in terms of how Enlightenment, there are different types of enlightenments vis-a-vis the category of the human, be it Locke with a human that is naturally endowed with rights, and then the Kantian version of the human that has to do with the capacity to self-transcend and autonomy that grants dignity, or in later variations of Enlightenment in the thought of utilitarians, be Bentham and others. What's important in the utilitarian thinking is that units of utility are equally distributed among humans as such. You don't give more weight to utility of someone who are you associated with in different modes. So we have the category of the human, which is a major moral and political achievement. It has a broader history, it has a prior history, but it's a very strikingly Enlightenment mode. And, but it's a very fragile and precious achievement, very vulnerable. The category of the human is one of the most morally vulnerable categories that there are, very difficult to maintain. And I think one thing that we learn from Améry's response to the Counter-Enlightenment is his strong attempt at preserving that category, at maintaining its moral force. And basically, I see three fronts here that he is tackling when he understands how vulnerable is this concept of the human. The first is a clear context, which is racism, ultranationalism in different forms, right? The category of human doesn't exist. It's us and them. Whether it's hierarchically described or oppositionally described, that doesn't matter. It's just us and them. There is no place to the human. And you think about ultranationalism. Well, ultranationalism is marked by the fact that the associational identity of the nation is such that it undermines the equality of rights of minorities within the nation in a consistent way, including attacking all those institutions that are there to defend it. The courts, the press, civic societies, etc., etc. So we have this phenomenon and also, I mean, one other feature of ultranationalism is that the interests of the nations are not in any ways contained or constrained by humanistic values. The nation has to pursue its interests über alles, before everything, putting America first, etc. So we have that challenge that Améry is very interested in understanding how that challenge makes the category of the human so fragile. Then we have the second challenge that comes from his very ambivalent relationship with Marxism. Though he sees Marx as a figure, as an offspring of the Enlightenment, he doesn't think that Marxists are offspring of the Enlightenment. And by the way, his relationship with Sartre, you mentioned the Baader-Meinhof case. He was very upset with Sartre, wanting to interview and meet, and Baader, he thought, was this kind of, he was such an admirer of him. And he thought it was a major failure, moral failure on his part. But what you have is a class structure, right? It's either the working class or the bourgeois, and it's not clear for him that Marxists have any idea of what the human is, including the reinterpretation of the Enlightenment as a kind of a ploy, as a universal conspiracy, as a conspiracy of the bourgeoisie to talk the universal language in order to maintain their domination over the working class. You actually quoted the very powerful lines of him. So that's the third front where the idea of the human is so fragile. It's a sort of, you have it from the right, you have it from the Marxist left, and then Foucault and the post-structuralists, and he sees in them, in some ways, no less dangerous attack on the concept of the human, and that has to do with the idea that the human subject is an invented artifact, right? In terms of the Foucauldian project, it's invented with a science so we can control. This is a kind of a very complex dialectic. So my thinking about, and I would say here I feel more affinity with the Améry's project than the issue of progress, though you have pointed to the ambivalence of this idea. But he's dedicated to defend that precious, fragile category of the human, as he perceives under immense attack from different directions. As I said, from those three directions that carry immense intellectual political weight, and he sees them as thoroughly dangerous. And it's a dangerous moment. It's a moment where stakes are so high for him in preserving that category of the human. Now, what I would like to do, is point to what I believe is a kind of an internal tension in Améry that adds, in some ways paradoxically, a deeper and more complex fragility to the concept of the human. And that has to do not with the external fronts that he is confronting as Counter-Enlightenment, but his own experience and biography, and his own thinking coming out of his own biography. That has to do with, I think, two very great achievements of his as a thinker. One is the concept of home. Home. He has this essay, How Much Home Does a Person Need? Home, I'm not sure is a good translation. Heimat. In the Hebrew, they translate moledet, which is homeland, whatever. One is the concept of home. I think it's a very deep essay. And the other one is the idea of resentment. And they both survive, I would say, under a general title of the concept of exile, which I think is one of the deepest thinkers on the category of exile. And this is a category I'm interested in. Different thing. Actually, there is a powerful book by Yitzhak Ber. I think one of the latest book published here in Germany from Jewish studies called Galut, exile. Very, very, very beautiful essay. So I want to explain his ideas on these two topics, and then the internal tension they raise with the very idea of the concept of a human. I think a very subtle tension and complex, adding to, in some ways, the fragility of that category. Okay, so now in this essay about home and how much home, Heimat, does a person needs, he has an interesting take on what home is, and now I'm warning a little bit that it's on my own slight reconstruction. I hope it's trying to improve a little bit on a great author. Okay, so I would say, what is it to be at home? What does it mean to be at home? Well, to be at home means to lower the threshold of alertness, right? I would say, if we say someone is homeless, we literally mean he sleeps outside. I mean, people do different things at home and outside of home, but one thing all people do at home, which is to sleep. I mean, for example, in New York, there's no eating at home, right? Just you see the kitchens. But sleeping still. So a homeless person means he sleeps outside. Meaning, what's privileged about home literally is that you can be in total condition of not alertness, meaning sleeping. And the experience of being non-alert being at home means the capacity to read your environment. Right? You go in a strange place which you don't know how to read well. You don't know what gestures means, what signs means, what nuances mean. And you're constantly on guard. You're in a hyper state of alertness, which it's very tasking, it's horrible, being a stranger in that respect. So being at home means a place where you can lower the threshold of your alertness. Just be at home. And by the way, Améry has very powerful descriptions of this, right? He describes the movement from Germany to Belgium. He said, I come to Belgium, I see this person, I don't know, is he smiling at me? Is he angry at me? Does he have good intentions, bad intentions? I cannot read any nuance here. I'm a foreigner. And that has a major impact on your capacity to read the environment, to understand the reality you're in. This is why I would call high state of alertness of a stranger ongoingly very taxing. That means another thing which has to do with trust. Because to trust someone, I think, is to entrust someone to that. There is a relationship between trusting and entrusting. Right? So it means that you make yourself vulnerable by putting at the hands of someone else an interest, a vital interest of yours. Let's say you go to a doctor, physician, or a lawyer, or whatever. Say, well, that's very important. I trust you with that very vital interest of mine. It's giving of trust. Well, and if you have trust in self, I mean, some people think that their own interests should not be given to themselves, right? They're not worthy of taking care of themselves. Right? So the act of trust means that you have a way of reading your environment. Right? By the way, he says something very interesting. He says, even if you are there for a long time, and he describes his French experience, right? And he clearly mastered the language, and if anybody can read the nuance of French literature and other things, it's Améry. But he says, when it comes to the medical encounter with medicine, with physicians, with this, with that, I feel stranger. You know, it's interesting, by the way, because you are in such a position of vulnerability that you can function only if you can read very carefully subtle cultural messages that are going on interpersonally that as a stranger you cannot read. And you don't know, am I going to this surgery? Is that, though that, by the way, with trust, you need high level of professionalism, clear, but you need also care. You might be a very good professional, it doesn't care for you. Usually celebrity physicians are that type. Don't go to them. I mean, I remember a friend of mine went to a lawyer. I said, he's a very good lawyer. Do you want to win the case or be in the newspaper? That's a very different questions. So those moments of vulnerability where you need to read the signs of the world, and you're not being at home means unable to establish relationships of trust. That has to do with your own suspicion, self-suspicion, of your incapacity to read the signs, cultural, interpersonal signs. Now there is another feature of Heimat that he talks a lot about, which has to do with language. He says feeling at home in language is some way very much the same. Right? He says, he describes in a very powerful way the the way in which the linguistic horizons of him as a German shrank more and more in the places where he came, to a certain degree that he felt a loss of a language. He didn't have the language. And by language, we mean exactly the same thing that he meant by being at home, which is the capacity to read what words echo. What is their association in a language? I feel like that in English. I mean, I don't feel any sense of not being at home, etc. Not on that respect, but many times I'm not sure I use a term properly. I understand. I'm sure I'm making, as I talk, different blunders, not being a mother tongue. So he talks about that as a constitutive feature of his experience, which that draws him to a strong attack on the very idea of possibility of a cosmopolitan identity. He speaks very dismissively of what he calls cosmopolitan tourism. You can be a tourist only if you have a home, all right? And by the way, I would say you can be a cosmopolitan or a diasporic Jew as an idea only if you have a passport of a strong country and better a tenure at a certain university, right? So this idea that and fascinatingly enough, he feels that his defense of Heimat, and he wants to, as he talks, he wants to distance himself from the sort of romantic kitsch, sentimental identity talk that he knows how dangerous it could be. As he is affirming the idea of homeland, including affirming not only cultural homeland, but national sovereignty when he talks about the Czech problem and other things in this essay. There is another issue that I want to address in that respect, and then I'll come to his concept of resentment. When he talks about his Jewish, this essay in the mind's limit, on the mind limits, his essay on the impossibility and necessity of being a Jew. And he says, he says, I didn't grow up religiously, culturally as a Jew. That's not my world, that's not my language. If I study it, it will be completely artificial. I'm not going to Judaize myself now. I'm not going to read Hasidic texts or Buber, etc., etc. So, no way. It will be false, it will be inauthentic, etc. And then he says, and I'm forced to be a Jew by the Nuremberg laws, by other things. Right? And at a certain moment, I'm gonna read this because it's interesting. At a certain moment, he says, so maybe I should just be a human being. What's the problem? He says, I'm going to be a human being. And why I'm so tortured about my place? And he says, well, who doesn't want to be a human being? But you're not a human if you're not a German or French or a Christian or a member of a social defined community. He says the abstract concept of a human as defining a meaningful identity or place doesn't exist for him or altogether. Now his problem is he cannot lean back on his German, what comes to him natural, which is German identity, because that is completely blocked for him. His Jewish life is not authentically deep. The only thing he can do is kind of this very interesting mode is accept his Jewishness as a fate and shove it at the face of everyone. He's not going to be a closet Jew, etc., etc., and he will which he understands that lacks depth and lacks robust sense of being at home, but that's the only home that he can find in his search for home. So we have this, what's happening is the following, in terms of my own understanding of tension as we see. You have a very, very powerful moral and political category of the human. But the weight, the moral and political weight that is ascribed to that category is not carried by our actual experience at home within a very particular nuanced life as an issue. I want to speak another, now I think that a lot of his conceptions of exile, home, he was so troubled by that, and I think besides his very powerful essay on Auschwitz and torture, I mean, these are very, very powerful essays on the other side of what is it to be in exile. And there is a level of existential exile that has to do with resentment, which heightens the problem we're talking about. What is resentment? And it has to do also with this concept of mourning. What is resentment? What's the sort of his resentment? The sort of his resentment is the following. It's not about actually being tortured, being harmed, etc. It's about the fact that that experience doesn't have any echo around. The gap between the personal trauma and pain and the world out there is so hard to bear that you begin to resent the world, and it's a heightened condition of isolation, where you are alone in your pain. It doesn't have any echo. It's actually, by the way, in a very minor fashion, is the condition of mourning that people experience personally, right? The world goes on as if nothing happened, and doesn't reflect any of your own experience as a mourner. And this is why in Jewish law there is an interesting analogy between the mourner and the excommunicated. There is an isolation from the world. Now, since there was no moment of, as he read, and you have discussed that very beautifully both in the dialogue and your talk, he has never experienced an actual acknowledgement of the harm, serious reckoning with that. He never experienced that. And he thought that the other side of reckoning, and comes resentment, is that in some ways endorsing empathetic relation to revenge has to do with the fact that the only way, revenge is a empathy mechanism, empathy creating mechanism. When I'm going to bring you to my situation, we're going to share a world of pain, which will relieve me of my isolation. Right. So here is what I would call an existential category of exile, where you are absolutely isolated, where your inner mode of pain that is open and keep on being felt doesn't have any echo in the world. So that there is an analogy will be the Armenian experience with the Turkish denial. It's kind of you can see resentment that comes out of it, because what you're making of us, isolation, basically isolation can lead to madness, as if you cannot read reality. The gap between your own experience and the world out there is so strong that you don't trust anymore either reality, your reading of reality, and that's a form of hyper radical existential exile. Now, so what do we have? We have an attempt, a very powerful attempt on his part, to to defend a very precious achievement of the Enlightenment, which is the category of the human. And he has, what makes him, I think, as an Enlightenment thinker, very deep, that he understands, first of all, how fragile that category is, given all the counter-Enlightenment movements that he is experiencing, and also given his own account of Heimat and resentment. Now, what is exactly the solution to that? I mean, one way to go about it, just by way of finishing my own presentation, will be the following. You would say, one definition of barbarism, you say, what is barbarism? Barbarism is a world that doesn't have the category of the human. Societies that all their moral vocabulary, all the moral furniture is associational. You know that they're barbaric. Now, so one way to overcome the tension, a certain internal tension, is to say it will be better if this is our idea of how embedded we are in a language, in a place, at home. It will be better if those categories of the human will be derived and supported by that particular language that you have. If I want to give I'm going to give an example, actually a contemporary example from a German experience, which was very impressive for the world out there. Why? So when Merkel took, I think, the most noble position vis-a-vis refugees, at a certain moment, till attack from the right, etc., and then there was realignment of. And you would say, what drove her? And what drove some public support for that? It wasn't abstract conception of enlightenment. It was a particular view of German history and the commitments that come out of the German historical experience of the 20th century. So is this a way of, I would say, bridging the weight of bridging the way to carry the weight ascribed to the category of the human, the political and moral weight ascribed to the category of the human, with our deep, with his sense at least, how abstract and existentially unreal is that category in our actual lives? That's just a thought. Okay, I'm going to end here, and I think it follows Susan's presentation in a focus on a particular aspect of the Enlightenment here, which I think is both dear and precious to him, and what I call the fragility of that category, both externally and internally to Améry. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Just see that there are quite a few. I write down everyone on my list. I'll start with Susan.
Thank you, Moshe. That was really interesting and helpful in all kinds of ways. I have two sort of questions, possibly objections. So, without wanting to get into a whole long discussion of what actually was moving Merkel,
Okay.
So I'm going to leave that aside. What is absolutely true, however, is that thousands and thousands of Germans were moved by, you're right to say, by thoughts about German history, and it went beyond just hanging up welcome signs in train stations, which did happen. People for quite a long time were taking strangers into their homes and teaching them and helping them also. So that was genuine. It certainly had reference to, thoughts about German history, but I would argue that the concept of the human is so deep in us, since the Enlightenment, that we take it for granted. And I agree with you that it's a vulnerable category. I think that's a really important thing to say. But it's also something that we just so take for granted as in, yes, of course people of other, countries, genders, faith, are also human beings, which is not entirely clear before the Enlightenment. I mean, you may have it in some places. So I mean, I think we're presupposing it more deeply than we think. And then that leads to a question about your remarks about the human as an achievement, which I entirely agree it was an achievement of the Enlightenment. How do you think Améry deals with, on the one hand, Foucault's idea that the human being is over? I mean, it seems to me that one could say, building on what you said, is, yeah, it is a constructed idea. And the construction of that idea was an achievement and one we need to protect. I don't know, I hope that was a clear question.
Sure. So thanks. So I would say, first, it is so deep in us, right? We take it for granted, and it's amazing how quick it is to collapse, especially under conditions of pressure. Under conditions of heightened fear, in war, you've seen it in so many different ways, the us and them. And many times, under condition of what I would call thin identity that needs another to affirm itself, so-called the enemy from within. I'm agreement on how deep it is, and we're in agreement on how fragile it is. And I think one contribution of Améry from reading him is his understanding of that condition. Now, I think as far as Foucault goes, I think that it's not clear what sort of an argument against something, against something say that is constructed. So what? I mean, also a water reservoir is constructed. I mean, it's not clear what the moral force of showing that something is constructed, as if the only valid things are what? The part of the very furniture of the cosmos. I never understood the force of uncovering here. But I think Foucault wants to do something else, which is to say that the human sciences, the growth of the human sciences, demography, criminology, psychology, sociology, etc., are just very insidious ways of discipline. So there is a whole, first you construct the human subject, then there is a whole human science around you, which allows you to shift from punishment to discipline. Now you can discipline through all this knowledge, right? For example, now that you have a lot of pharmacological knowledge, you can control a class by distributing, how is it called, those pills? I forgot the name. Not antidepressants, against
ADHD.
Yeah, ADHD, etc. So there is a whole science around. So that's the way Foucault at least imagined, and he thought, and that's why Améry think of him as a dangerous. It's interesting. He says he's not only ambiguous, ambivalent, etc. He's a dangerous figure, right? Because Foucault thought that destroying the idea of the human is somehow liberating, right? And from a pro-Enlightenment figure such as Améry, and from his own mature understanding of history, there is something childish almost in this game that he understands. He understands the impact of destroying such a category because he has experienced it. What do what is your experience in a political world that completely obliterated the category of the human, right? And that's why for him this is no game, right? Yes.
Peter is next.
I want James. Just a short question, and it goes along the line of being at home where you sleep.
Right.
I'm very curious how Améry would have reacted had he heard this, and I'm now asking you how you are reacting to Imre Kertész, who during a conference said to a journalist, Paul Jandl, and I'm not sure whether he ever wrote this or only said it to this journalist, you know, I actually felt at home in Auschwitz. It's, for me, so unbearably absurd, but then behind this absurdity, because I've very often thought about Heimat and where you belong and where you feel at home, I did understand it to a certain degree, but I'm very curious how you react.
I don't know, it's such a troubling, complex sentence. It's so hard to make sense. Maybe to say, maybe, it's a world that was completely predictable and understandable. Not understandable, but predictable. And by the way, there is some survivors' experiences that I know firsthand, secondhand, of being at loss outside, being confused.
Like someone who leaves prison after.
Exactly. I think maybe he meant that. He meant something highly predictable and cruelly regimented. That's a very convoluted, complex idea of home, right? But I think it maybe evokes that, and I know, I encountered it in different personal acquaintances, that's experience that some survivors describe, of not knowing, being at loss. Maybe that's possible.
Now, James Wood, please.
In some ways, my question is actually just an addendum to Peter's, but it's about the very interesting connection between exile and resentment that you were talking about. I'm not sure that this is an answerable question, really, but I wonder to what extent Primo Levi's ability to forgive, and we remember the quarrelsome relations between these two writers, and the way Améry called him the forgiver, had something to do with being able to return to Milan, I believe, to the very same apartment that he was born in.
Well, I think it's such a gap. I think it's such a gap between Primo Levi didn't feel he was betrayed by his own culture, by his own world, by his own language. I mean, as an Italian Jew, this is a completely different experience. So he came back. And to feel at home, he didn't need this experience being echoed in Germany. He didn't care much, or he didn't, I would say in that respect, he didn't care much about how to read the German response, right? He had a home. And that's a big difference between them. Linguistically, culturally. Améry was in that respect in a very unique experience. Also, as a German Jew, he was fully German. I mean, he was the most pure Austrian. Sorry, it was the purest product of Bildung. I mean, of German and Austrian culture. So,
as he said, he didn't lose a home. He realized he never had one.
Yes, yeah, it was a retroactive death. Yeah.
Stephen Holmes is next.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to probe your defense of the human and your objection to the abstract human being. So you start with this wonderfully profound idea, I think, of Améry's, that the difference between writing in your native tongue and writing in a foreign language is not that you know the language better, but you know your audience better. I think that's a very deep thought about, particularly for people who write in other languages. But you then move to this idea that you never see a human being, you only see a Frenchman or a German, which, as you probably know, that's a direct quote from de Maistre, basically, and it's a part of the Counter-Enlightenment, this idea. So one way of thinking, I remember Susan said, it's one of the core principles of the Enlightenment is to distinguish between tribalism and universalism. But there's actually another antinomy of tribalism, which is individualism, and treating other people as if they're individuals, and locating all value, not in the distinction between being a member or a non-member, being a Jew or not a Jew, but being an individual. That's where all value is. So I think this is just another question about criticizing universalism too facilely. And then, just as I know you hate the word methodology, but why do you use the word the human as a non-empirical category? Because you know human beings are a lot of bad things about human beings. And it's like saying the dental are only healthy teeth. So the human are only... so why do you choose to moralize what should be a descriptive category?
Well, because the whole point, I think, of the Enlightenment achievement is to add a normative weight to the category of the human, right? It's not an empirical description. You say, qua human, you are now qua human, not qua anything else. You're a carrier of rights and dignity and other things, etc., etc.
Not as a Frenchman or a German.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the whole point. That's the ultimate achievement of that world, politically, that we try to defend, that we try to... I think we're so horrified when we see different ways in which this normative category is undermined. I think in that respect, we are all, I don't know, at least I'm sure you, others, have deep sympathy with Améry's concern of saving and protecting that category that is both not empirical in that respect and also extremely fragile and hard to maintain. So in that's why I use it as a, because empirically, when we talk about dehumanization, right, that's a normative category in the way that humanism is a normative category. So that's why I'm using it this way.
Mario Kessler. Yeah. Just wait for the mic, please.
Just a brief addendum to this very multi-complex presentation. Thank you very much. Not many people in this room may have been educated in the DDR in old East Germany, but I was. And at the University of Leipzig, the historian Walter Markov, the teacher of two generations, including myself, mentioned Améry's essay Philosophia Perennis exactly in the context that you described. When he lectured about the Gegenaufklärung, about the historiographical trends in order to deconstruct the French Revolution. We are about 1979, 1980. And he mentioned Améry in a way that he said, he is an intellectual without a home, ein heimatloser Intellektueller, and Markov said, and he is not, because he belongs to us. That means to a socialist discourse beyond let's say, the boundaries of Stalinism, and it had also a double meaning. Améry survived Auschwitz. He was tortured. Walter Markov spent not less than 11 years in jail under the Nazis, and he said, he belongs to us. That had a double meaning, which nobody of us could forget. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very powerful remark.